Ladies and gentlemen, lords and comrades, great to have you here. I would like to declare there's a bird in here.
Yes.
I would like to declare the second Clifton Festival officially open, and wonderful that you're all here. I hope you enjoyed today. Lots of people who've been here before, lots of new people. Thanks for coming. And today we have Armando Iannucci to open the festival. You will know who he is, but he is the premier satirist of our era, really. In the thick of it, in the Loop, Veep, and the death of Stalin. So just an amazing amount to talk about, and I'm sure many of you know those shows, those two films, and much else we can discuss. I should say that our relationship, such as it is, began because we had someone in common.
Yes,
Stalin. Yeah, we had Stalin in common.
We're great fans of Joseph Stalin.
Yeah. And he's a sort of mutual friend.
Yes.
So
yes.
So that sort of brought us together originally, and we had a dinner in.
Yeah, I did the film The Death of Stalin. You told me that the Sunday Times asked you to do a hatchet job on the historical inaccuracy of the film.
Yeah, they said it's bound to be rubbish. Can you review it? And I watched it, and actually, the film, I don't know, I hope most of you have seen it. You must see it if you haven't. It's so relevant, but it's also absolutely brilliant treatment of a very serious subject. But so when I saw it, I mean, I was amazed. It was accurate, and it was funny, and it was horrific at the same time.
The thing I say to audiences when we're screening it is the stuff that's in it that you believe we probably made up, but the stuff in it that you don't believe, because it's so absurd, is absolutely true. So you know, the film opened with, you know, when Stalin falls over, they have a discussion as to whether to get a doctor in, and then they say, well, which doctor? Because Stalin put a lot of doctors on the death list, and if they get the wrong doctor and then Stalin finds out, they might get killed, so should they get a bad doctor instead of a good doctor? And it's all absolutely true.
But I mean, the relevance of the doctor's plot, I mean, we're jumping ahead here, of course. There was the doctor's plot was this insane plot by Stalin, which was essentially an anti-Semitic conspiracy that he'd invented. That he said Jewish doctors were trying to kill the leadership, including himself.
Yes, and he said Jewish, not Zionist doctors.
Not Zionist.
You've got to be careful.
Yeah. So
you've got to.
I mean, the relevance of
that's
this.
All sorted now.
That's all sorted. I mean, and of course, I mean, the fascinating thing historically is that event, the doctor's plot, is really the direct source of Corbynism today, or a key part of Corbynism in many ways. Well, it goes straight back, doesn't it?
And I'd say it's sort of symptomatic of a lot of politics, left and right now. I mean, when you saw, I was watching the Kavanaugh QC trials on television, and irrespective of who said what and who's telling the truth and what happened, there was one bit where he basically said that anyone who brings an allegation of sexual assault is left-wing. And I just thought, that doesn't show impartiality for someone who's about to go in the highest court in the country. It's that, and I think we've fallen into that labelling of, you know, you're either with me or against me. If you're against me, then you're an enemy.
Well, it's the age of sanctimonious rage, first of all.
Yes.
But also a sort of Manichaean divide. And that was, of course, very, very Stalinist. We'll come back to Veep in a second.
Yeah. Someone explained the rules of Stalin, which is that you weren't allowed to, in meetings, he welcomed debate. And you could disagree with him in a discussion if you were talking about something that was your department. So if you were head of agriculture, you could maybe make a point saying, well, General Secretary, that's not quite right, the grain harvest is it, and he would accept that. But if you talked about something outside your department's bailiwick, then that was factionalism.
Yes.
It's when two or three people talk about something other than their own immediate concerns, that's seen as factionalism.
And of course, one feature of it is the sort of immense hate. They hate people on their own side who are slightly heretical, much more than they hate the opposition.
That's right.
So Stalin sort of much preferred Churchill and Roosevelt to sort of socialist Mensheviks on his own side who would kill anywhere.
That's right. And you get that now with, you know, anyone who was a Blairite in the Labour Party is now called something like a Tory dad or soft Tory.
And similarly, traitor.
Similar traitor.
Yeah.
And similarly in in the Conservatives, you know, there's no meeting of minds between the Remainers and the Rees-Moggs of this world, if they are of this world. There's no attempt to find a common ground. I think that's what's behind a lot of people's dissatisfaction with politics. For example, when Brexit happened, and you know, I thought it was a shame that the vote went the way it did, but I thought, but there you are, the people have spoken. But I think I'm not the only one who thought, therefore, because it was such a split vote, the parties would come together, or political leaders would come together and try and iron out an agreement together. Whereas in fact, you've got it being driven, one faction of the Conservative Party, itself a minority government, driving another faction of it. You know, that's that, and I think it's that fragmentation and that refusal to find common ground. I think people find very, very frustrating about politics.
And you're a champion of the second vote, aren't you? You're a champion on Twitter.
I sort of came to it reluctantly, because I did think, you know, well, that's the vote, and, you know, I lost, there you go. But I've been so disillusioned by what's happened the last 2 years, you know, put aside for one moment whether the Leave campaign was legal or illegal, because I'm sure there were illegalities all over the place. I just felt the argument since then has not involved any of us. It's involved factions within the Conservative Party. And and for something that all politicians said was the biggest thing to hit the UK since the Second World War, then why, as in the Second World War, why aren't we coming together to sort this out rather than separating off?
And just to jump over to America, I mean,
yes.
And to go back to Stalin, I mean, there are scenes in that Stalin.
There's a slight
slight leap there. Well, I've always thought that sort of Trump wants to be the first American czar, effectively. But obviously, he also has a huge weakness for totalitarian autocrats, doesn't he? I mean, he loves Kim Jong-un. He loves strong people who can order people to be whacked on any opportunity. He thinks that's the sort of sign of kind of macho leadership.
Yes.
So there are scenes in Trump's kind of White House court that are very Stalin-esque, aren't they?
Well, the scene that sticks in my mind not long after Trump took office was that scene when the photographers and television cameras came into a cabinet meeting, his first cabinet meeting in the White House, and it went round all the heads of his cabinet, who all basically had to say what a great honour and privilege it was to serve under Donald Trump, and how blessed they have, and how Christ has rained his glory and wonder on his life to be able to serve under such a glorious leader. And it was very Stalinist. It was you sort of felt, if you look carefully, there was a gun behind each person's head, or the chair would administer an electric shock if they didn't say the right words.
There was also another scene when Vice President Pence literally gave a sort of half-an-hour speech of praise, wasn't there?
Yes.
Which is just pure Stalin.
That's kind of Molotov, really.
That's Molotov.
That's, you know, the hard line.
Talking of which, when we had dinner at a curry in Soho, we were just talking about Stalin and Molotov. When Molotov walked past the window, Michael Palin, who plays Molotov in the film,
he just
walked past the window, and I went, hang on, wasn't that Molotov? And he looked around, and Michael Palin came in, and
because he then turned up.
They had a quick sort of Molotov-esque conversation.
But what's interesting also is, you know, you realise this isn't that long ago, because I did a screening of the film in Los Angeles, and at the very end, a guy came up with a sort of big moustache and a beard. He was in his sort of 40s, longish hair, and he went, really loved the film. I'm Tolstoy. Trotsky. I'm Trotsky's nephew. And you thought, oh yes, and that's the, you know, you realise this was the 1940s, the 50s, the 60s. Well, Stalin died 53, but it's still, you know, only a generation or so away.
Yeah.
And the number of people who, Russians who saw the film afterwards, coming up to me and saying, you know, it's funny, but it's true. I mean, that's what happened. That's what
the strange thing is the film is so accurate and yet treats something so terrifying. And I think Russians totally get it, because Russians know there's such a thin line between the absurdity of power and the horror of power. And Westerners kind of aren't quite used to this.
Yes.
They think that serious subjects have to be treated seriously. Well, Russians know that laughter is the best way to destroy power, as Donald Trump found out in the UN the other day.
Yes.
But do you think, I mean, do you think that in some ways these serious, you know, comedy is a valid way to discuss really terrifying things?
I do think that
Could you do the Holocaust, for example?
Well, you could, but it depends, You could do it well or you could do it badly. You can't just say, I'll take this subject, I'll make jokes about it, and that's perfectly valid. I mean, it's the harder the subject, then the harder you have to work to make sure that you're not belittling. I do generally think that comedy is not, because you look at something from a comic angle, you're not belittling that subject. You're just trying to find a slightly different way of approaching it. And when people talk to me about Stalin and how, is it all right to make fun of the gulags and so on, I mean, two things I'd say is, in the film, we don't make fun of the gulags. We show the gulags for what they are. We don't make any jokes about it. All the comedy is about the people at the top. But also, I look at films like Charlie Chaplin's The Great Dictator, which was made in 1941, a satire about Hitler. During Hitler at the height of his kind of campaign across Europe, in which there are scenes set in the Jewish ghettos, in which there are references to gas chambers and so on. And it's also a very funny film, but it's also a very moving film. And I think if you do, if your intention as a comic is to be very insincere about a subject, then I think you lose your justification for tackling that subject. I think if you're approaching it with a firm set of values or with a firm argument, and the only way you can get this, you can portray this argument dramatically is through comedy, then I think that's perfectly valid.
Fake news is also a kind of theme of, Stalin was the master of fake news.
Yes.
And they really understood propaganda, as did Hitler.
Yes, in the film we call it false narrative, isn't it?
False narrative,
when somebody says something that has been superseded by a different fact, you call that false narrative. And
that's another great that film is oddly getting more relevant by the minute, isn't it?
It's strange because we've shot it 2 summers ago before Trump was even the nominee for president, but it emerged just as Trump was in office, and it had this strange. But then it was born of a kind of feeling over the last 4 or 5 years across Europe. There is this strange lurch towards populism, nationalism, right-wing, autocracy. Or, Erdogan in Turkey and in Hungary, the sort of very autocratic government there. And people like Berlusconi as well, looking at Italian politics. The fact that these maverick figures can come along. And I don't know whether it's also whether we feel that politics feels less real now. So why not have a laugh and elect Berlusconi or Donald Trump? See what happens. It's like a game, isn't it? Because politics, nothing happens with politics. It's all the same. So let's try something else. And then you realise, oh no, it is real. It does have consequences.
It does, and words matter, and
words
ideas matter,
actions matter, yeah.
And actually now, we really do have a real difference in politics now between the right and the left, which we haven't had for about 30, 40 years, have we? There's a huge difference.
But also for the first time, nothing in the middle either.
Nothing in the middle.
There's a strange vacuum there. It's almost like people are too frightened. Was it Vince Cable called it the march of the moderates? That already sounds like a party you don't want to be invited to, really.
Yeah.
Come along, we're having drinks tonight. We guarantee you an interesting time. It's just...
Another fascinating thing about it, which is another relevance, before we get on to America, which is a whole other thing, is, you see the security services in action. Berrier is an amazing character in this, actually a terrifying character.
Yes.
Simon Russell Beale is a genius as Berrier. And in fact, they're making dramas of some of my Stalin books. And I saw him the other day, and I said to him, you've got to come back and play Berrier, a serious Berrier, because he's absolutely nailed Berrier. But what's fascinating about the security agency stuff is that we're seeing Russian security agents are coming over and assassinating people all the time. The same spirit that you can just wipe out enemies. You should annihilate enemies, especially ones from within your own camp.
Yes, that's
is again happening right in front of us in small towns in England.
Yes, I remember watching an Adam Curtis documentary about very radical militant Islamic groups in Saudi Arabia, and one that was so radical that in fact they issued a fatwa on all other Muslims, and then on each other, and in the end there was only one left.
Yeah,
there was only one.
That could only happen in one of your films otherwise. Yeah,
So we
mentioned Vice President Pence, the Veep. I mean, again, sort of, you've kind of out-satired yourself in America, haven't you?
I've retired.
You've retired from Veep.
Yeah.
But Selina Myers is such an amazing character. She's a sort of nymphomaniacal, foul-mouthed, ruthlessly ambitious, talentless character. I mean, who's she? How many kind of leading? I mean, there's Palin, there's Hillary Clinton.
No, we
Where
didn't
did you
really
get
base
from?
her on anyone. Right? We sort of wrote her as you know, as Selina Meyer, but we spoke to Joe Biden's people and Al Gore's people, and we spoke to people who had worked with Dan Quayle. Do you remember Dan Quayle?
Yeah, there's a bit of Dan Quayle. There's a bit of the Quayle about her.
And it used to be the joke in America was the vice president is this nothing, nobody who. But actually, for me, it's a very funny role. I was drawn to it. I read this enormous biography of Lyndon Johnson, which still isn't finished by Cairo.
Yeah, it's
this
brilliant.
Full volume, 1,000 pages each volume, Lyndon Johnson. And he portrays this man who was very powerful. He was a Senate Majority Leader in the 50s, very powerful. He was able to get legislation through. He was able to strong-arm people, you know, threaten them, bully them, physically manipulate them, get them in the kind of the locker room and almost like wrestle with them. And he just knew how to get votes through. Second most powerful man in America, asked to become vice president, finds himself as vice president, literally sitting in his office, drumming his fingers, thinking, will the president call?
Ignored by the Kennedy brothers.
Absolutely,
yeah.
and that strain, and yet knowing that if something happened, as it did, he would become the most powerful person again.
Yeah.
And it's just that, it's that strange, so close and yet so far, and yet so close, kind of.
Well, didn't he say the vice presidency was like a bucket of hot piss?
That's right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
or something like that.
Yes. Yeah. But he did the maths or math in America, where he worked out that 1 in 4 vice presidents become president. And he thought, this is my best bet. You know, who knows?
But God forbid that Pence becomes president.
Well, that's the thing. All this march to indict and impeach Trump means that you will get Vice President Pence as president, who I think is a far more frightening figure, because the virtue of Donald Trump, and I never thought I'd use that phrase in any sense, the virtue of Donald Trump is he is so incompetent that actually the stuff he really wants to get through, he makes a mess of, and it doesn't get through. Pence is from the Senate. He knows how the Senate works. He would get, you know, the Republican Party would warm to him, one of his own, evangelical Christian background. You know, he would be a far more transformative and unstoppable figure than Trump. So I think, you know, if you're anti-Trump, hold on to him as long as you can.
But one of the themes of all your work, I mean, there are two really. There's sort of control of the power control, how power is controlled. But then the other side of it is that they're all utterly incompetent. No one knows what they're doing, and you created that word omnishambles. Omnishambles in the thick of it, didn't you?
Well, it's a sort of recognition. It's two things. First of all, none of the politicians in any of the stuff I've done are criminals.
Yeah.
You know, they are fundamentally okay as people. You know, they have their flaws.
Well, Stalin's a bit of a criminal.
Well, Stalin, that's...
You're forgetting. And Beria.
Yeah.
And Beria.
I'm talking about
Veep
Veep and the thing. I'm talking about modern politics.
Yeah,
you know, if anything, the minister, the elected, you know, Selina, is the figure you feel most, you identify most with, and it's the system around them that seems to push them into... I think, you know, I still do believe that a lot of people go into politics because they want to do something good. They want to make a change. They want to... You know, they might go in because they have an ideological reason, but that ideology is held sincerely, and they want to try and enact it. I think what happens is we place so much pressure on our political leaders, so much round-the-clock inspection. You can't make a mistake. Woe betide you if you're on holiday when a disaster happens, or woe betide you if you've accidentally put in your dog food voucher and receipt among your expenses, and because then you expect them to be absolutely perfect, and under this pressure they buckle, or they retreat and they panic, and then they start doing stuff. So that's the first thing I'd say. In that I'm not saying that we are governed by a corrupt elite. I'm saying we're governed by a group of people who think they know what they're doing, And if only they admitted, like all of us, that actually fundamentally we're kind of making it up as we go along, then it might just be a little bit more, we might get a better kind of dialogue going, really.
But one of the themes, one of the great themes of history is that when you look at both sides in any wars or struggles, you find out it's always the sort of, they're both utterly shambolic or omni-shambolic, as you would say. But actually the slightly less shambolic and the luckiest one actually win. But neither of them have a clue what they're doing.
Yes, but they're not these evil geniuses who
they're not evil
plan
geniuses.
out their... those people never make it, really.
No,
The Michael Heseltines who map out their career in the back of an envelope, Prime Minister age, that doesn't happen. The Boris Johnsons who, it's not going to happen. They fall into it, really.
Yeah, they're so often accidental, and your politicians are all kind of accidental,
Yeah,
aren't they?
John Major is the sort of, Claudius of... who saw him coming? I didn't quite, and he was around for, 6 years? So I don't think there are these evil geniuses. And I think also we have to accept that, government is imperfect and therefore human. And for example, Westminster, I did a thing at the Scottish Parliament, which opens itself up over the summer to do like a festival of politics. And I was struck by the Scottish Parliament building, because it's a relatively new building. It was designed to have the people come in. So you can visit the building, you can go and you can watch the debates, anyone can come in. If you go to Westminster, the Palace, that is a building that says, fuck off. It's just say, you can't come in. Yeah. Come on, fuck. And if we were to raise it to the ground and start again, I'm sure we would come up with a different concept of how a parliamentary building should function. Why aren't we allowed in? Why don't we have events like this within Westminster? Why don't we, have proper discussions? And I think, events like this show, I think people are hungry for some kind of encounter in the real world with people rather than on screen. So there's that. And also, the more we're aware of the fact that it is just another workspace, the better. When we were researching Veep, I went around the State Department. Two things. One is, a journalist told me, I had a little BBC pass at that time. I was still at the BBC, and the BBC pass was just basically my photo with the words BBC next to it. So, a 3-year-old could have printed it. But a journalist said, if you go up to the front desk at the State Department and say, Armando Iannucci, BBC, I'm here for the 12:30, you'll get in. Yeah. And so that's what I did. And they showed me, and I thought they'd take me to the 12:30, whatever that was. No, they just let me into the building. So I ended up wandering around the State Department thinking, well, I might as well take photos because, we're going to have to build this. We might as well. And I thought, this is fun, but it is also international espionage. And then this big guy came up and said, excuse me. And I said, I'm here for the 12:30. And he went, oh, it's just done. And I went down, and it was Condoleezza Rice's press briefing. But when I went around the State Department and I was speaking to people, they showed me things like, in America, they're very, very shy of spending money on federal buildings because that's taxpayers' money. You don't want taxpayers' money going on government. So everything is the cheapest. So the desks and the chairs in the State Department don't match because they've got the cheapest desks and they've got the cheapest chairs, but the chairs don't quite fit the desks. So you can't quite sit in. So everyone is like that. And then I went round the West Wing. They showed me around the West Wing, and people are so desperate to say they work in the West Wing that they'll find the corner of a corridor and just sit on a little stool. So I saw like 4-star generals kind of sitting on a little stool with a lap, just so they could say I'm working in the West Wing. And once you kind of see all that, you think there's nothing special here. It's just people. And the sooner we recognise that and not give them this mystique, this aura. I mean, that's how the Stalins of this world get away with it. They manufacture an aura about them. They also had guns. That's the other thing Stalin had. But Jacob Rees-Mogg doesn't have a gun. Well, he probably does actually, doesn't he? Because
probably has a few shotguns.
But it's this, the aura that they try and project, and that's a very powerful thing because actually, when you analyse it, there's nothing there. It's just it's like the teacher at school. The two teachers at school. Say you had a class that was very noisy, and one teacher would pop his head in, and everyone would go quiet, and they didn't have to do anything. There was just something about them that made you go quiet, whereas another teacher would pop their head in and you just throw things at them. You know, and that fascinates me. What is it about certain people that they can do that without having to do anything else?
So what do you think it is about the autocrats? Because that's, you know, Erdogan, Putin, I mean, obviously they kill people. That helps a lot.
Yes.
That is the best way to make an impression on people.
Yes, especially their opponents. The more opponents they kill, I suppose, the more secure their position.
You know, that's the fascinating thing about these kind of this
But
Skripal.
it's the language as well, though, isn't it? It's the language of, and Trump does it. He talks about, you know, you've got to be tough, you've got to be hard, go in hard, be smart.
Rats. We're going to wipe out rats.
Rats. That's right. Yes. Yeah. Heavens. Yes.
No ratting. No flipping.
Yeah. It's the mobster talk,
It's
actually,
mob
isn't
talk.
it? You know, he's got to flip.
Yeah.
You know, this is language from 1930s Chicago.
Well, he's kind of copying it from kind of the mafia John Gotti when he was growing up.
Yes.
And the New York Times did a brilliant sort of comparison of what, did you see that? Where they compared guess who was it? Was it John Gotti or was it Donald Trump?
Right. God, if the mafia tweeted, I mean, I wonder what that would be like, their tweets.
Very like Donald Trump's, I think. Yeah. But of course, Stalin also came from the criminal underworld.
That's right.
And
yes.
He was
a robber, bank robber.
He was a bank robber. And the security services in Russia directly come from that tradition, which is what you see with Skripal and Litvinenko and stuff, which is you wipe out rats.
And also, what we saw more recently is this lack of fear of the truth. You know, say anything and say it confidently, even if everyone knows it's a lie. But if you keep saying it, people will gradually come to believe it. So whether it's Trump saying that the Chinese are now trying to bring down his government, or climate change is a myth invented by the Chinese, or whether it's, you know, an ex-Russian spy saying, no, we were just going to Salisbury to visit the cathedral. It's a wonderful cathedral, brass rubbings, and you know.
Yeah.
And clearly, you know, it's sort of laughing in the face of the truth, but it's laughed so confidently that people think, well, I mean, he's not showing any hint of doubt whatsoever. So is it true? I better just check. You know, it's this just, and and I don't think yet the media or opposition politicians have worked out a way of dealing with this, because it's so outside the rules of any kind of normal discussion.
But it's very Orwellian, isn't it? I mean, it's exactly what Orwell talked about.
Well, it's 2 + 2 equals 5, yes.
Yeah. So do you think, I mean, before we get on, I want to go back to sort of how you got into all this crazy stuff. But first of all, just
I was recruited by...
were you recruited by the
actually by MI5, I was
well, the former head of MI6 is here.
Is he?
So he may be in this room.
Is he allowed to raise his hand?
He's not going to raise his hand, but he's speaking later. So
I once gave a talk to MI6. This is true. I gave a talk to MI6. I was contacted by a group, and they said, we have we do social evenings and so on. Would you like to give a talk about comedy? And I said, yes. He went, we are the security forces. And actually, it's only because of what we do, we socialise together. So we have speaker evenings, or we have theatre trips, and we get people in. You know, last week someone was coming to talk about art, and we've got some. So I went along, and the first thing I said to a room not unlike this, on the phone I said, I'll be showing some clips. Do you have a video? Or it shows how long ago this was. And the voice went, do we have a video? Yeah, we've got a video player, yep. And I arrived, and it was M's briefing room that I was. So it was all high tech. And you didn't touch anything. You put your hand over something, and the lights went down. And then you did this, and the curtains opened and stuff like that. And I said, I'm here to talk about comedy, and then I'm afraid I'm going to have to kill you. And I said, little opening wrap. And then there was questions from the audience. And at the end, somebody put their hand up at the back and said, this isn't a question, it's just to say that we're finished now and we are going to have to kill you. So.
Love it. Now, you've just been filming, your latest project is David Copperfield. So you've gone from Stalin to Copperfield to sort of steer forth.
Yes.
Are you exhausted by satire? I mean, is our world today of sort of Donald Trump, Jeremy Corbyn, is it beyond satire? Are you defeated?
I think I don't think it's beyond satire. It's just, I think there must be new ways of looking at it. You know, one of the most effective things I find about coverage of Trump is a thing called Sassy Trump on YouTube. Great actor and sort of impressionist, Peter Serafinovich, does this thing called Sassy Trump. Look it up on YouTube, and it's basically Donald Trump footage, but revoiced, so he sounds like Liberace. So, and it just takes all that mobster out of him. because his hand movements are so he's like, I'm going to build a beautiful wall, such a good wall. You know, it's just really, but it also it strangely makes you listen to what he's saying and you just think, this is a madman. Those words don't make any sense, you know. So there's that, but I also feel, I don't know, I think the best, most powerful response to people like them is to vote against them, really. That's you know, rather than just make jokes. I worry if you make jokes, it kind of accepts them as on a par with, you know, Thatcher and Major and Blair, and actually I think we've gone beyond that. We've gone into a world where these people think they're untouchable, and the only way to touch them is by voting them out. So I'd far rather concentrate on that. Having said that, you know, I'm not at the moment making much stuff about the present day, but, you know, as with anything that's either historic or I'm doing some sci-fi as well, you know, it inevitably is about the present day. So, you know, the death of Stalin was about totalitarianism and authoritarianism now. Even looking at something like David Copperfield, set in the 1840s, I mean, the story is so contemporary because it's about being poor and then rich and being poor and status anxiety and not wanting your slightly posher friends to find out about your less posh background and your poor background and putting on a front, you know, and trying to invent yourself to make your way in the world and then realizing you should stop inventing yourself and just be yourself. Lots of really contemporary, and you know, and housing conditions in the 1840s. We spoke to Shelter to ask about, you know, what the worst forms of housing, what the biggest housing issues now as opposed to like in 1840, and it's the same. It's like, in this country, our landlords have more power than any landlords in Europe. You know, they are allowed to throw people out. In Germany, if a property passes from one owner to another, its tenants do as well. You're not thrown out. There has to be a justification for throwing someone. Here, the power is with the landlords, and rather like in the 1840s. So we show housing conditions in the 1840s, and also I wanted the film to reflect society now. So in terms of the casting, it's a much more sort of diverse cast. I mean, Dev Patel is playing David Copperfield, and not to make any kind of point, but just to kind of give it a sense of you're kind of watching what these people in the film feels like the present day. You know, people in costume dramas act like they're in a costume drama. It kind of always looks like it's the past, and in fact, to them it should be modern. I mean, in 1840, London was like Manhattan. It was like the center of the world. It was like the railways were being built. You know, buildings were going higher and higher. It was the heart of an empire. It was people from all around the world were congregating there. It should feel exciting and big and new and made of iron and stone and not just cobbles and mud and stuff like that. So it's about that, trying to make something feel relevant to now.
Yeah. Tell me, how did it all start? Tell me about your family. So your father was Italian.
My father came from...
Mother's Glaswegian.
Yes, but her parents were Italian. So,
okay, so you are totally Italian.
Yeah, so two waves of immigration from Italy after the First World War and after the Second World War. You know, people leaving shattered economies and looking for work. And Glasgow was, at the time, a big shipbuilding city, but also a port. So, and people would travel by boat rather than by airplane. So you would have people arriving, departing Glasgow, the Glasgow shipyards, and when one wave of Italians came over and said, "Hey, they like our pizzas here, they like our food, you know, there's work here," then another wave would come over. And so there's an enormous Italian community in the west of Scotland, and my father came over, and he had an interesting. I mean, during the war he actually fought against Mussolini. He became a partisan and wrote for an anti-fascist newspaper at the age of 16 and then had to run to the hills, change his identity and so on. And as soon as the war was over, he felt he had to leave.
Did he talk about it?
Very, very rarely. I remember once when The World at War was being shown for the first time, and when it got to the concentration camps, he kind of got up and left the room saying, "I can't watch this, but you have to stay and watch this." And I think it was because, you know, and God forbid we ever have to go make this decision ourselves. When he fought, he had to kill his own countrymen. You know, he was fighting against Mussolini and the fascists, and you know, and that's a terrible thing to find yourself having to decide what to do. You know, that for that whole generation, that's a dreadful sort of dilemma to put in. So I think he left Italy and started again, and he ran a pizza business. You know, I grew up with my father and his sort of business partners. They had a pizza factory with a big kind of Heath Robinson-esque type pizza making machine that went the length of the.
And did you help in it at all?
In the summer, yeah, you'd help in the summer. You'd see the dough go in at one end, and then the tomato, and then the mushrooms, and they come out the other side as a fully formed pizza.
And do you love pizzas, or can you
I
never
do,
bear never
yes,
to see
no,
them
no,
again?
no, I do, but I'm very, very picky about my pizzas.
And how did you go? And how did you go from Glasgow to the BBC and then start making?
I was a huge radio comedy fan. You know, I listening, and again, just luck that I grew up in Britain where there was a big radio comedy tradition. We have a bird
There's
here.
a bird here.
This is actually a robot controlled by Putin, this bird.
Yeah.
Don't touch it on any circumstance. Don't touch it. Yeah, so... so a huge radio comedy fan, listening to like things like the News Quiz and Radioactive. Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy came out when I was young, and that was a sort of revelation, really, like what you could do with comedy. It's not just gags, it's concepts. You know, it's surrealism and reality at the same time. It's storytelling. So I was absolutely besotted with it, and I would write comedy. I would write jokes. I would steal jokes. I was doing, you know, locally sort of stand up when I was about 13 and 14, just and voices and.
And you got into you helped create Alan Partridge with Steve Coogan.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that was really my first job at the BBC, was as a radio producer, and I was sent on a course to. Which they all go on, a program making course, but it was all about how to make a serious news program. And I thought, well, I don't want to make a serious news, so I made a fake news program, and I got various people in to do that, but that should sound as real as possible. And that became On the Hour, which then became The Day Today, and that generated Alan Partridge. And you know, and with someone like Steve, you know, I like working with people who are very collaborative and can improvise a bit. And I said to Steve, you know, I need a sports reporter. Not an impression of a particular one, but a kind of an amalgamation of all of them. And he did a kind of, it was much more John Motchton-ish when he started, but he did a kind of, well, someone like this, someone speaking like this, you join me here, kind of, he does it much better than me. But the moment he spoke, everyone in the room knew who this guy was. And somebody said, he's a Partridge. He's somebody, and someone else said, he's an Alan. And Alan... He just like emerged fully, you know, like when a foal is born and it just gets up and starts walking about. That's how Alan emerged in this kind of, you know, Pringle clothing and blazer and all sorts, you know, sports badge and stuff. He just emerged like that. And the moment, and Steve, when he becomes Alan, and he can talk for hours as Alan, you know, the detail starts filling in and the flesh starts being put on the bones. Yes.
Yeah. And then the thick of it.
Yes.
How did that? I mean, talking about now, you don't want to sort of satirize things, but that was a direct satire on Blair, the Blair government.
Blair, it was that sort of over managerial style of government, that controlling.
Alistair Campbell.
Yes, the kind of what's on the grid, and someone went in my research for the thick of it. Someone told me they used to work in the Home Office when, or it might have been Education, when David Blunkett was the minister, and he was having a bit of a brainstorming session, and two civil servants came up with two ideas, one the direct opposite of the other, and rather than him deciding straight away which one he wanted, he said which one would play better in the Daily Mail.
Yeah.
Okay, let's go for that one. So it was a case of, that's when I just thought, hang on a minute. You can't just have A and not A, and then, you know, not have a view about it, other than, you know, which would play best. And so that, and that kind of politics frustrated me. It also frustrated me that someone like Tony Blair could take the country to war when so many people around him, from experts to, you know, the electorate, was saying, this is crazy, what are you doing? And yet somehow, because we don't have a constitution, or because the way our system of government works, a prime minister with a majority is a monarch in Britain. Yeah. They have total power.
The King's prerogative.
There are no checks and balances. The House of Lords isn't a check and balance. It's a pausing mechanism, but it's not. It can't overturn. So that sort of angered me. And so I wanted to do something. And I'd also been researching for a documentary I did about Yes Minister and the power of Yes Minister as a way of, for the very first time, I think, allowing us into Parliament to see how government worked. Going back to what I was saying about Westminster being you can't come in here. I mean, we forget that it was only recently that they allowed cameras into Parliament, you know, in the sort of mid sort of early 80s, they let cameras in. Before that, it was just reported. And so Yes Minister was really, although it was a sitcom, was really a kind of way into seeing how government worked. So I went to the BBC with an idea for a kind of modern Yes Minister. I thought the dynamic in Yes Minister had changed. It wasn't about a senior civil servant trying to stop the minister from doing anything. It was about their obsession with the media and with the polling and the focus groups that was hampering their decision-making process.
You're really a very sort of mild-mannered, genteel
Yes, I'm
guy,
not really a swearer.
But your characters are the most disgusting, foul-mouthed. Selina Myers, Malcolm Tucker.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a bit unfair. But if you can, what is the foulest line you've ever written? I mean, you probably can't remember, but I mean, if you can
I can tell you the only line that we ever got taken out.
Oh yeah, tell us.
By the BBC lawyers. The only time they ever said you can't say that was when Malcolm says, "This is awful. This is as awful and as bad as the thing they'll find in Jimmy Savile's basement when he's died."
Whoa!
And
yeah, that's amazing.
And the lawyer said, "You can't say that."
Yeah.
And
what date?
This was pre-Savile death.
Yeah,
I think.
Of course. Yeah.
You know. But this was what? So this would be early 2000s, I suppose. Yeah.
Now, your two greatest heroes are, I'm guessing this slightly, but your two greatest heroes not Stalin, yeah. Woody Allen and John Milton, the writer of Paradise Lost.
Yes, I'm rethinking one of them now.
Yeah, before we come to questions, so that's Milton you're rethinking.
Yes.
Just tell us, give us a very quick, because we're going to have questions in a minute. Everyone think of something, but Woody Allen, Milton.
Well, Woody Allen, I mean, I grew up, you know, when he's very funny, you know, Take the Money and Run, Annie Hall, Sleeper, just packed with gags and all sorts of ideas. Really, a kind of throwback to like Buster Keaton and Charlie Chaplin as well. That just pure comedy, gag, visual, and then I loved the confidence in which he went into things like Annie Hall and Crimes and Misdemeanors, where he wasn't afraid to be serious and yet funny at the same time, and played about with the form and didn't take. You know, people can take film very seriously. It's interesting how we have experimental theatre, or not even experimental, popular theatre, where the cast can come and talk to the audience, where they can run around in the audience, where they can. But drama is still very linear, very literal. We don't take those kind of formal risks with drama, whereas in comedy you can. Comedy's all about disruption and subversion. So I enjoy that. Milton, I just was awestruck by Paradise Lost the first time I read it. It's such a powerful, dramatic, and for Milton, who was a Puritan and very highly moral, you know, his greatest character is Satan.
Is the devil, and he's very attractive.
Is the
bit like
mesmerizing.
Bit like your barrier.
But deliberately mesmerizing. It's almost like Milton is trying to tempt us and say, actually, is it quite attractive, what you say? You know, and I did a documentary about Paradise Lost, and I kind of came up with this, I hope it isn't too trite a conceit, saying that, you know, Beelzebub in Paradise Lost is Satan's spin doctor, because Beelzebub they just take language and they shape it and change it. They say, you can make a heaven of hell and a hell of heaven. Evil be thou my good. I mean, it doesn't make sense. Evil is the opposite of good, but he says evil be my... Almost like by just saying it, you're somehow making the facts change, you know. And that's what politicians who use rhetoric do. They mesmerize you with their words. And that's why Trump is at home when he's doing a rally, because he can say what he likes. He's got his followers out there, and he can say anything and present it as fact when it's not fact, but there's no one there to challenge him. You know, it's why he will not sit down and do a one-to-one like this, where someone like you could come back and say, but that's just not true. So that interests me. So Milton's very modern, and he was Cromwell's spin doctor. That's the other thing. When Cromwell became the Lord Protector, Milton was employed. He was called Secretary of Tongues, and basically his job was to write in Latin pamphlets explaining to the crowned heads of Europe, explaining Cromwell's actions and trying to justify them. So he was there to put the spin on Cromwell's actions. So,
yeah.
I mean, I only worked this out many, many years after the fact. I didn't finish I tried to do a thesis, a PhD at Oxford on it.
Never. And what was the title of your thesis?
Oh, I had religious language in Paradise Lost, and it grew. But I spent all my time writing comedy, and I stopped when I realized that the opening lines of Paradise Lost, of man's first disobedience and the fruit of that forbidden tree, have the same rhythm scheme as the theme tune to the Flintstones of man's first disobedience and the fruit of that forbidden tree. And that's the point where I thought, okay, I see where this is going. But about 20 years later, I did this documentary for BBC Two on Paradise Lost, and I got a very nice note from my supervisor saying, consider the thesis complete. So that's
very nice.
So there we go.
Well, that's a good place for us to view this as complete.
Yeah.
So let's have questions. There's a lady there. Please ask. Well, wait for the microphone, please.
Thank you. It's a fascinating discussion. Could you tell me to what degree your formal education either liberated you or restrained you?
Well, it kind of liberated me. I went to the sort of local primary school where Billy Connolly was an alumni, and I was there. This was when I was about 7 or 8, and he was beginning to get quite big in Scotland. Originally when I was there, he was getting well known in Glasgow and in Scotland. And I remember our teacher, it was a Catholic school. I remember our teacher saying it was a sin to listen to Billy Connolly. He brought these records out because he did the thing that made him famous in Glasgow was this whole routine on the crucifixion that he did. And it was all done in Glaswegian accents. And it had Christ urinating on the centurion for giving him a sponge full of vinegar and stuff like that, you know. And so the teacher said, it's a sin to listen to Billy Connolly. About 3 or 4 years later, he became big. He went on Parkinson. He became a national hero. He was invited back to the school. So that instantly taught me about hypocrisy within institutions. But I then went to another school in Glasgow run by Jesuits, and I had a lot of time for them because they were very much into, no, you're given a brain and you're given an intellect, you're meant to use it. So they encouraged questioning. So a lot of our sort of religious education was us being allowed to say, isn't it all bollocks? And what do you mean the resurrection? How does that work? You know, and they would have to try and... So I kind of had a lot of... It's interesting the current Pope is a Jesuit because it's very... They're encouraged to question. There are two types of Jesuit. There's the kind of the James Joyce, you know, hideous disciplinarian who just beats up children. But there's also the gun-running, left-wing political, you know, ideal, you know, just about engaging with the world. So I had a lot of time for them. So in that respect, that questioning, that kind of being allowed to put your hand up and go, this is a bit silly, isn't it? Yeah, that I got from there, I think.
Yeah, this lady here in the...
Yes, thank you very much. I came here prepared to hate you because I hated the death of Stalin.
Oh, why did you hate it?
Well, okay. Well, you kind of answered my questions already about that because I felt it was belittling the history of the Soviet Union, and I actually think some topics shouldn't be a subject for comedy. So, having said that, I really enjoyed listening to you both. And Simon, I didn't like the young Stalin either, but that's beyond the point. So my question is...
Let's keep going. Let's keep going.
I will keep going. I'm very excited by everyone laughing, almost like President Trump. But my question is, I can see how you're fascinated by power in history.
Yes.
And you obviously want to understand how power works and how dictators work and how we work with dictators and what impact it makes in history. So my question is, are there any political figures in history who are whom you respect, whom you are mesmerized by in kind of positive sense?
Yes.
And if you can't name one, maybe top 3 will do.
All right. No, I'm a huge respecter of people. Clement Attlee, who would never survive in politics today. This little sort of bank manager, bald moustache, kind of office clerk, really, but who managed to enact quite fundamental changes to how Britain worked that are still around today, and which we still, venerate as part of British, what makes Britain special. I think Trump as a retort to Obama is a harsh retort, but I think, in years to come, Obama will be regarded as transformative. I mentioned Tony Blair. What angered me was the Iraq escapade blighted what would otherwise be quite an impressive track record of government in terms of getting child poverty down. It's when he went a bit crazy managerial, everything should be a beacon of excellence, and I think there's a rule that really, once people are in office for more than 6 years, they go mad. And you can chart it. Thatcher was absolutely off a rocker by 6 years in. Blair, I think, just was. Because after 6 years, you've been in a world where most people have agreed with you or have protected you from, have filtered out the opposing point of view. And I think you lose grip with reality. Most presidents who do 2 terms, their last couple of years in office in America are usually strange years where they're trying to look for a legacy. So there's that, yes. But on the death of Stalin point, I absolutely take your point. I knew, and that's why we spent a lot of time going out to Russians, speaking to Russians, because I knew that this was a very sensitive topic, and some people just won't, it will be so strong for a lot of people that they won't be able to tolerate the idea of it being the basis of comedy, and I absolutely take that, on board. You're not going on any list.
Yeah, there's the guy. Yeah, please.
Thank you. If you were to produce a film or satire about Silvio Berlusconi, you wouldn't have to do very much because he could be the principal actor, he could write the script,
yes,
and he could pay for the film. You could go to Italy, brush up on your Italian, have great food. What's to lose?
Well, that's partly my point, which is the current brand are their own entertainers. That's how Trump, I think, sees himself. He's obsessed with figures and ratings. He'll talk about the failing New York Times. He'll talk about how NBC is losing viewers. How more people came to my inauguration than anyone. He's obsessed with a measurable popularity. And so to achieve and maintain that popularity, he has to do something every day to make the headlines. So he knows what he's doing. He'll know which button to push in that morning's tweet to get everyone talking about it. So they are their own. I've called him a self-basting satirist in that he is. Just read him, and you've found the joke about him. It comes out in what he says. So it leaves people like me slightly redundant, I think, really, other than to just point it out. Yeah.
Sorry, this lady here.
Thank you. I just wondered if you had any plans to make a drama out of the Brexit saga.
No plans whatsoever. Because again, I've lost my sense of humour about it. I just find it, whether you voted Leave or Remain, I find what's happened the last 2 years tragic because we haven't been able to come to any kind of common agreement about what it is we want. And also tragically, no one has actually offered any kind of vision of what a post-Brexit Britain will be, other than we'll do these magic trade deals. How you make amazing deals with countries that know that you're desperate for anything, I don't know, but it's not a good bargaining position to start from. But there's been no wider debate about, okay, what does it mean to be British? What does it mean to be the United Kingdom? What are our values? What do we respect in terms of our history and culture? It's descended into a question about economics and finance and tariffs. And I don't think in the end people voted for or against on the basis of tariffs. I think they voted on a much more emotional calculation about, what kind of country do we want? And yet that bigger, wider, slightly vaguer debate hasn't even been started yet. And that's what I find kind of disturbing. Yeah, the future, yeah.
What's next? Somebody, yeah, you, yeah. Yeah, you.
You won't
There's
get
no one behind you. There's no one behind you.
Simon, you won't get the job as the next presenter of questions.
No, I won't.
Yeah,
No, I won't.
yeah, you there.
Just like to say...
The sort of idiotic-looking one.
I didn't say that.
Yeah, no.
I didn't say that.
These are the outtakes from the...
Carry on.
I'd just like to say
process.
first, I did thoroughly enjoy the death of Stalin, so I didn't come prepared to hate you.
Stick your hand up. I'm just... right, okay. Just as a disembodied voice. So, yeah.
Why, in your work, do you choose to focus on the sort of secondary figures in politics instead of the leader? In the death of Stalin, Stalin dies in the first 15 minutes. You barely ever see the PM.
Because I think that's where the decisions are actually made. One of the most shocking things when I looked into politics in the UK and then in America was how many 22-year-olds were running the country. These people who either do PPE at Oxford or a degree in politics at Georgetown University in Washington. And then, one guy was telling me Bush asked him to go out to Iraq to help draw up the Constitution. And he was like 24. And I thought, you probably haven't even bought a house, yet alone tell another country how it should. And yet that's what happens, these people, because the people at the top are far too busy to deal with all of this. They've got to do this lunch and then go and speak to this person, then they've got to attend this meeting, and then, they've got to do a visit to that. They haven't got time to think of the ins and outs of what kind of voting system should Iraq have and how do we engage the warring factions against each other so that we come up with an electoral system that accommodates all the involved. They haven't got time. So they just go, oh, you do it. And so some kid is, and people told me in Washington, if you hang around the key people, if you just for example, I think it was when Rumsfeld was defense secretary, and he liked to play tennis. Suddenly everyone took up tennis. So they could just meet him in the changing room and go, hi, you don't know me, I just work 3 doors down from you. When Obama was president, suddenly everyone took up basketball because that's where he played. And somebody told me, Washington's a big place. There's a lot of power swilling around. And if you can find a corner of an office, a phone, contacts book, if you're in the room, they said, you're in power. Somebody told me about Madeleine Albright when she was Secretary of State. She taught her staff what she called bladder diplomacy, which is don't go to the toilet. Be last in an 8-hour meeting without going to the toilet, because the moment you leave the room, a decision might be made that you're not party to. So just sip, don't gulp, and it's to do with that, and that's what interests me. It's not the people at the top, it's the people, the nameless, the anonymous individuals further on down who are actually making the big changes. So the person in the White House at the moment that we should be focusing on is this guy, Stephen Miller, who's only about 37, 38, looks like a Bond villain, talks like a Bond villain, probably is a Bond villain, but he's the one that's writing, Trump speeches and what's going on. Yeah.
Last question, this lady here in the white.
That's very
Trying
good.
to improve
very
my qualifications. Yes. Question time.
The handsome guy at the back with the
beautiful woman in beautiful woman in cream. Yeah.
The beautiful woman with the microphone.
Yeah, very quick question.
I do enjoy your satire, but I do think you're preaching to the converted. And I was very interested to hear you say you're really interested in making people vote against these people. So how could you use your skills, for example, in Middle America, to make people question what's going on rather than thinking, oh, he's just being rude or...
Absolutely. I think part of the problem is that there's been a tendency for people to write off. It goes back to what we were saying earlier about not actually accepting the other point of view, to write off anyone who has a different point of view as an idiot or a racist or mad, and it's not that at all. People are frustrated, they're angry, they feel left out, they feel not spoken to, they feel unheard, and it's about that. And I think it's about trying to generate, in circumstances like this, or much more locally, involvement in participation in discussion about politics. What I found interesting about the referendum in Scotland on independence was that they opened the voting up to 16 and 17-year-olds. And initially I thought, what do they know? That might be mad. And in fact, it was wonderful, because suddenly 16 and 17-year-olds woke up to politics and woke up to how important it was, because this was them literally voting on the future of their country. And suddenly they took the whole thing very seriously indeed. But
that's what's happened with Momentum as well.
Yes, and for all its kind of cultishness and the cult of Corbyn and so on, the fact that it at least engages younger people in politics, I think, is a good thing. It should be replicated by the other parties, otherwise you're going to get a very skewed younger generation. But what was heartening, I think, about the last election was that actually the youth vote went up, because I think increasingly younger people have been not voting and have then been discovering, because they don't vote, they're not powerful. One MP told me that if in the last day of an election you've got time to visit either a student halls of residence or an old people's home, you go to the old people's home, they're going to vote. Just go to the students' home, 30% of them are going to vote. It's a waste of time. And I think that's what happened. Young people, and so when there were cuts to be made, it was made to young people. It was tuition fees. It was taking away housing allowance and student supplement, all the different allowances and disability allowance. But it was affecting young people because they weren't a threat to political careers. So the more that young people vote, irrespective of who they vote for, the more they actually vote, the bigger and more powerful a group they become, and politicians then have to start listening to them. And that, in a microcosm, is an example of what happens generally when we vote. You're perfectly entitled to spoil your paper. You're perfectly entitled to write it, but if it's the power of politicians knowing that you vote. And the voting participation had been declining since the 1950s. So I think there was a Labour government that got in 2010, or something like only 60% of people voting, and they won 35% of that vote. I mean, it was tiny. And I just thought that's just a nonsense, really. So what was good was that voter participation went up and young people's participation went up. So that at least at long last, maybe because of Brexit, so we've suddenly woken up and thought this is important. At long last, we're getting engaged in it, and I think that's what it is. And I think it's also important for politicians to explain what they mean by terms that they use again and again and again, and that they assume we understand them. But we didn't do PP at Oxford. We don't know what tariff reform and single market means. You have to explain it. Don't just say it, explain it. Explain it, and then we'll engage. I think it's about that, really.
I think it's time for some bladder diplomacy.
Right, okay, yes.
Thank you so much, Armando. Brilliant.
Pleasure. No, thank you. Thank you.